The challenge begins. The arena was massive, larger than any human stadium. Thousands of alien spectators filled the stands, their voices blending into a deafening roar. The air smelled of smoke and metal. Bright lights shone down on the center of the battlefield, where a single human woman stood, facing the champion of the Tarkith Empire. She was small compared to him. The alien champion, Vorak the Unbreakable, was nearly 9 feet tall, covered in thick, armor-like scales. His muscles rippled under his dark green skin, and his glowing red eyes burned with amusement. He laughed, a deep, thunderous sound that made the ground tremble. "This is your best warrior," Vorak sneered, looking toward the alien warlords who ruled the tournament. A fragile little human. "This fight is an insult." The crowd erupted in laughter. The warlords sat high on a grand platform, their faces filled with cruel smiles. They had allowed a human to enter this gladiator battle as a joke. No human had ever lasted more than 10 seconds against their champions. Vorak took a step forward. The ground cracked beneath his massive foot. But the human woman, Sarah Carter, did not move. She did not flinch. She just smiled. The first test. Begin the match. A warlord roared. A deep gong echoed through the arena. Vorak charged forward, moving faster than anyone his size should be able to. His massive fist swung toward Sarah's head, a single blow that would crush her skull. The crowd leaned forward, expecting instant death. But Sarah was gone. She moved at the last possible moment, shifting her weight and ducking under the attack. Vorak's punch smashed into the ground instead, sending a shockwave through the arena. Dust and debris flew into the air. The audience gasped. She was still standing. Not just a human. Vorak turned, narrowing his glowing red eyes. "You're fast," he admitted, "but speed won't save you forever." Sarah didn't respond. She simply raised her fists. Vorak growled and lunged again, this time swinging both arms at once. No escape. Sarah didn't try to run. Instead, she stepped toward him. The move was so unexpected that Vorak hesitated. In that fraction of a second, Sarah twisted her body and struck, a precise, brutal punch to the side of his knee. Vorak stumbled. The crowd fell silent. No human had ever made a Tarkith champion lose balance. Vorak snarled, regaining his footing. "You dare strike me?" Sarah tilted her head. "Isn't that the point of a fight?" The crowd, still stunned, suddenly erupted into a mix of cheers and jeers. Some aliens were impressed. Others were furious that a human had landed a hit. Vorak clenched his fists. His pride was hurt. Enough of this. The real battle begins. This time, he fought with full strength. He kicked at Sarah, a powerful strike meant to send her flying across the arena. She barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side. She needed a new plan. Sarah had spent months studying alien fighting styles. She knew Tarkith warriors relied on their brute force. They weren't used to opponents who could outthink them. If she tried to match his strength, she would lose. But if she could outmaneuver him... She took a step back, lowering her stance. Her breathing was steady. Her mind was clear. Vorak rushed forward again, bringing his massive arms down to smash her into the ground. At the last second, Sarah leaped onto his arm, running up toward his shoulder. The move shocked him. He tried to shake her off, but she was too quick. Before he could react, she struck the side of his neck, aiming for a nerve cluster she had studied in secret. Vorak roared in pain. He staggered backward, shaking the entire arena. The moment of truth. The warlords watching from above leaned forward in their seats. This was not how the fight was supposed to go. "Impossible," one of them muttered. "A human should not last this long." Vorak wiped blood from his mouth. His own blood. His eyes burned with fury. "You are stronger than you look," he admitted. "But this ends now." Sarah rolled her shoulders. "We'll see about that." The crowd held their breath. For the first time in the history of the Tarkith Empire, A human was standing toe-to-toe with their strongest warrior. The next attack would decide everything. The first strike. The arena was no longer filled with laughter. The aliens who had once mocked the human now sat in stunned silence. Even the warlords, who had seen countless battles, leaned forward, their expressions unreadable. Vorak, the undefeated champion of the Xarkath Empire, stood with his massive fists clenched, his red eyes locked onto Sarah Carter. Blood, his own blood, dripped from the corner of his mouth. This was not supposed to happen. A human should not have survived this long. A human should not have hurt him. Yet here she was, standing tall, unshaken, her breathing steady. And worst of all, she was smiling. The champion's fury. Vorak growled deep in his chest. "You think this is funny?" Sarah tilted her head slightly. "A little." The audience gasped at her words. No one ever mocked a Xarkath champion. The sheer arrogance of a human saying such a thing, it was madness. Vorak's lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "I will break you." And this time, he meant it. He launched himself forward with terrifying speed, his massive legs cracking the ground beneath him. His fists swung like wrecking balls, each strike strong enough to turn a human into dust. But Sarah was not there. She dodged, not by running away, but by moving in close, staying just within range of his attacks while weaving between them with precise, effortless motion. Every punch missed her by mere inches. The crowd watched in disbelief. No one had ever seen a human move like this. Vorak, frustrated, slammed his foot down, creating a small shockwave that sent dust and debris into the air. It forced Sarah to jump back, exactly what he wanted. With his opponent finally at a distance, Vorak raised both hands above his head and smashed them down. A massive shockwave erupted from the impact, sending Sarah flying backward. She crashed into the ground, rolling to absorb the impact before flipping back onto her feet. The crowd roared, believing the fight was over. But when the dust cleared, Sarah stood there, brushing dirt off her shoulder like nothing had happened. Vorak's rage boiled over. The human advantage. Sarah exhaled slowly, her mind analyzing everything. Vorak was powerful, but power was not the same as skill. He was predictable, relying too much on brute force. His swings were fast but wasteful, using too much energy. He had never needed to fight efficiently because no opponent had ever survived long enough to force him to. That was her advantage. "Are you done yet?" she asked casually. The audience froze. Even the warlords exchanged glances. Vorak took a deep breath, controlling his anger. "You are nothing but an insect." "A mistake. I will." Sarah moved before he could finish. In a flash, she closed the distance, faster than he expected. She ducked under his arms and landed a brutal strike, a precise punch right into his floating ribs. A sickening crack echoed through the arena. Vorak staggered. The crowd gasped. No one had ever made him stumble before. He gritted his teeth, pain flashing in his eyes. "You dare?" Sarah smirked. "Looks like you're not unbreakable after all." The audience exploded into noise, some cheering, some screaming in rage. The warlords exchanged uneasy glances. This fight was not following their script. Vorak straightened, rolling his shoulders. "Enough games," he muttered. "You had your fun. Now you die." The unfair advantage. Suddenly, a faint beeping sound filled the arena. Sarah's sharp eyes caught the glow of something attached to Vorak's wrist, a small device. Before she could react, his body pulsed with energy. Sarah's instincts screamed danger. He charged again, but this time, he was faster. His fists cut through the air like lightning, his strength even greater than before. Sarah barely dodged the first blow, but the second one grazed her shoulder, sending a sharp pain through her body. The crowd cheered wildly. They saw what had happened. The warlords had given him an enhancement device, a combat booster that pushed his speed and strength beyond natural limits. They weren't just letting him win. They were making sure she would lose. A fight against the system. Sarah wiped the blood from her lip, eyes narrowing. "Of course," she muttered. "You can't beat me fair, so you cheat." The warlords did not react. They did not need to explain themselves. This was their empire, their rules. Vorak smirked. "You should feel honored. They think you're dangerous enough to deserve it." Sarah rolled her shoulders. "Then I'll just have to win anyway." The audience went wild. A human defying the empire itself. Impossible. And yet, they could not look away. Sarah planted her feet, her mind already adapting. She had beaten impossible odds before. She would do it again. Vorak lunged, his enhanced power making him a blur. Sarah gritted her teeth and prepared for the most dangerous fight of her life. The Empire watches. The moment Vorak's body surged with unnatural power, the entire arena shifted. Before, the battle had been a spectacle, a mockery of human strength. But now, something had changed. The warlords, seated high above the battlefield, no longer looked amused. They looked concerned. Their champion, Vorak the Unbreakable, was supposed to crush the human. But instead, they had been forced to interfere. And worst of all, the human had noticed. The cheating game. Sarah felt the shift immediately. Before, Vorak was fast and strong, but still bound by the limits of his species. Now, after activating his enhancement device, he moved like a phantom, his attacks coming in a blur of motion that barely gave her time to react. Sarah ducked, dodged, and rolled, but the punches kept getting closer. A glancing blow hit her side, sending a burning shock through her ribs. Another strike slammed into the ground beside her, sending shards of broken stone flying in all directions. She could feel the heat of the impact. If she had been just an inch slower, it would have crushed her spine. The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in outrage. Some of them had never seen a human last this long. Some had never seen their own champion struggle. And some of them, Sarah realized, were starting to root for her. A fighter who thinks. Sarah didn't panic. She had fought cheaters before. It wasn't about being faster or stronger. That wasn't a battle she could win. She had to be smarter. Vorak's enhanced speed and power were formidable, but they came with a weakness, overconfidence. He thought he had already won. Sarah watched his patterns, calculating his movements. He was stronger now, but his attacks were wilder, less controlled. Reckless. A warrior who had never needed to think had just been given more power, and he was using it like a blunt weapon. Sarah grinned. "Come on, big guy," she taunted. "Let's see what that little power-up really did." Vorak's eyes burned with fury. He charged, moving faster than she had ever seen. Sarah stepped sideways at the last second, just enough to avoid the blow but close enough to test a theory. The energy field around his body flickered for a moment, like static electricity. Sarah's eyes widened. There it is. Exploiting the flaw. She had seen technology like this before, back on Earth. Power enhancers were not limitless. They burned incredible amounts of energy, which meant they had a time limit. And Vorak? He had never needed to pace himself before. Sarah took a gamble. She stopped running. The crowd gasped. Even the warlords exchanged confused glances. "She's giving up," one of them muttered. But Sarah wasn't surrendering. She was baiting the champion into burning out his power. Vorak snarled and lunged, fists glowing with raw energy. Sarah barely dodged the first strike. The second one. She let it hit the ground beside her. The third. She sidestepped just enough to let it graze her shoulder, giving him the illusion of victory. Every attack cost him energy. Every attack wore him down. The moment of truth. A minute passed. Then another. Vorak's breathing became heavier. His glowing aura flickered. His footsteps slowed. The enhancer was running out of power. Sarah smirked. She had won the real fight. Turning the tables. Vorak threw one last wild punch, his speed half of what it was before. Sarah caught his wrist, the first time she had physically stopped his attack. The crowd went silent. Vorak's eyes widened in shock. Impossible. Sarah tightened her grip and twisted. With a loud crack, Vorak's massive body crashed to the ground. The arena shifts. The warlords rose from their seats. This was not how the fight was supposed to go. A human was not supposed to outthink one of their greatest warriors. A human was not supposed to last this long. And most importantly, a human was not supposed to win. The new challenge. Before the crowd could process what had happened, the Grand Warlord himself stood and raised a single hand. The arena fell into silence. Sarah looked up, her breathing steady, her body sore but still ready to fight. She knew what was coming next. "You have proven yourself against one warrior," the Grand Warlord announced, his voice booming across the arena. "But a single fight does not prove your worth." A massive gate rumbled open, and from the shadows, 10 more warriors stepped forward, each as strong as Vorak, if not stronger. The crowd erupted, some in excitement, others in shock. Sarah exhaled. "Of course," she muttered. "It was never gonna be that easy." Turning the tables. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Some cheered in shock and admiration. Others screamed in rage. But every single alien in the arena had one thing in common. They couldn't take their eyes off the human. Sarah Carter stood breathing heavily, her body battered and bruised, but her stance still firm. At her feet, Vorak, the so-called unbreakable, lay on his back, defeated. His chest heaved, his face twisted with disbelief, but he did not move. She had won. And yet, the battle was far from over. The Grand Warlord stood high above on his throne, watching with cold amusement. "You have proven yourself against one," he announced, his voice booming across the arena. "But a single victory does not make a warrior." A deep rumbling filled the air. Behind Sarah, a massive gate creaked open. The sound alone sent a chill down her spine. The audience exploded into cheers as 10 figures emerged from the shadows. Elite Tarketh warriors, each bigger and more dangerous than Vorak. Their battle scars spoke of experience. Their eyes held none of Vorak's arrogance, only calculated malice. These warriors were not here to entertain the crowd. They were here to kill her. The warlords' fear. From their thrones, the warlords watched with cloaked expressions. This was no longer a game to them. When the human first entered the arena, they had laughed. Now, none of them were laughing anymore. Sarah Carter had done the impossible. She had defeated Vorak without alien technology, without enhancements, without mercy. And that was a problem. Because if a single unaugmented human could defeat their greatest champion, then what did that mean about the rest of her species? For the first time in their empire's history, the Tarketh felt doubt. They could not let that doubt spread. Sarah Carter had to die. Surrounded, the warriors closed in, circling her like predators stalking prey. Sarah clenched her fists. This was bad. One-on-one, she could use speed, agility, and strategy to outmaneuver her opponent, but against 10 at once, the odds were impossible. She could already hear the crowd chanting for her death. She took a deep breath, rolling her shoulders. Fine. If they wanted to kill her, they were going to have to work for it. The first move. The first warrior lunged, swinging a massive energy blade that hummed with lethal plasma. Sarah sidestepped just in time, but as she moved, she felt the rush of air behind her, another warrior attacking from her blind spot. Without thinking, she dropped to the ground, narrowly avoiding a crushing strike meant to snap her spine in half. Dust exploded around her as she rolled, dodging another incoming attack. Too many. Too fast. She couldn't fight them all at once. They were too coordinated, pressing her from all angles. They're not like Vorak. Vorak had relied on raw strength, but these warriors were tactical. They weren't underestimating her. They were trying to trap her. Finding a weakness, Sarah's mind worked at lightning speed. She needed a new approach. Fighting them head-on was suicide. But there was something off about the way they moved. It took her a second to realize. They weren't fighting as individuals. They were fighting as one unit, moving in perfect sync like a military formation. And that meant they had a pattern. Sarah grinned. Patterns could be broken. Breaking the formation. The next time they struck, Sarah didn't dodge. Instead, she moved toward them. The closest warrior, expecting her to retreat, was caught off guard. Sarah exploited the opening instantly, twisting inside his guard and slamming her elbow into his throat. The warrior stumbled back, choking, and the formation shattered. Sarah moved like a storm, weaving between them with calculated precision, striking weak points one after another. A knee to a joint, a strike to the ribs, a knife hand chop to the side of the neck. She didn't need to win outright. She just needed to disrupt them long enough to level the playing field, turning the arena against them. As she fought, she became aware of the space around her. The arena was filled with weapons, traps, and obstacles meant to entertain the crowd. Now, she would use it to survive. She led the warriors toward a section of the arena where the ground was uneven, broken stone platforms rising at odd angles. Perfect. She jumped onto one of the platforms, forcing the warriors to climb after her. It slowed them down, throwing off their formation. Suddenly, they weren't coordinated hunters anymore. They were separated targets. And that was exactly what she needed. The final gambit. Sarah waited for the right moment. When the first warrior reached her, she struck fast and hard, using their own momentum against them. The warrior stumbled backward, right into another approaching fighter. They crashed into each other, falling off the platform. The crowd roared as two warriors were taken out in seconds. Sarah kept moving. She led another into a spiked wall, dodging at the last second. She used a falling pillar as cover to isolate a third. One by one, she whittled them down, turning the battlefield into her ally. Until finally, only one warrior remained. Sarah stood above him, bruised, bleeding, but still alive. The final warrior hesitated, gripping his weapon tightly. For the first time in his life, he looked afraid. Because he knew. He knew that he was looking at something far worse than a human. He was looking at a legend, the gauntlet. The arena had never been this silent before. For the first time in Tarketh history, an unaugmented human had taken down an entire squad of their best warriors. Sarah Carter stood at the center of the battlefield, her breath heavy, her body aching, but her stance was steady. Around her, the fallen warriors lay motionless, either unconscious or too injured to fight. The final warrior, the last of the 10, hesitated. His grip tightened on his energy spear, but he did not move. His instincts screamed at him. Charging this human was suicide. Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. She smiled. "Go on," she taunted. "Make your move." The warrior dropped his weapon. The crowd erupted in chaos. The Empire's pride at risk. The warlords sitting high above the battlefield were no longer amused. The entire purpose of these gladiator battles was to prove Tarketh's superiority. But now they were watching their strongest warriors fall. They were watching a human, one of the weakest species in the galaxy, stand victorious where no other had. And worst of all, the crowd was starting to respect her. For the first time, Tarketh warriors in the stands weren't just watching her with hatred. Some were watching her with awe. Some were even cheering for her. The Grand Warlord, his massive form wrapped in golden armor, leaned forward. His reptilian eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "This is dangerous," one of the lesser warlords muttered. "She is winning them over." The Grand Warlord smirked. "Then we will remind them why the Tarketh are feared." He stood, raising one clawed hand. "Bring forth the executioner." A deep metallic gong rang through the arena. The audience froze. And then, as if an ancient nightmare had come to life, a new gate rumbled open. A shadow loomed inside. Something massive stepped forward. The executioner arrives. A being twice the size of Vorak emerged from the shadows. A warrior so feared that most of the Xarkath had never even seen him fight, because no one survived to tell the tale. He was called Kalarath the Executioner. His black armor gleamed under the arena lights, his clawed hands gripping a warhammer that crackled with raw energy. The arena shook as he walked forward, each footstep heavier than thunder. Sarah felt the air tighten. This was different. Vorak had been strong. The elite warriors had been coordinated killers. But this? Kalarath was on a different level entirely. His glowing red eyes locked onto her, analyzing every injury, every breath. "You are interesting," his deep voice rumbled. "But you are also a mistake that must be corrected." Sarah rolled her shoulders, ignoring the pain. "Everyone keeps saying that," she muttered. "Yet here I am." Kalarath grinned, revealing razor-sharp teeth. "Then let's fix that. The battle begins." The moment the gong rang, Kalarath moved like a force of nature. His massive warhammer swung with impossible speed, the sheer force bending the air around it. Sarah dodged, barely. The hammer slammed into the ground, sending out a shockwave that tore the arena floor apart. Debris shot into the air. Sarah was forced to jump back, using the broken stone for cover. She had fought giants before, but none like this. Kalarath wasn't just strong, he was fast. He didn't waste movements. He didn't fight with pride or arrogance. He fought to kill. Sarah barely had time to react before he closed the distance again, his next strike aimed directly at her chest. She had 1 second to decide, and she chose to attack. The counter-strike. Instead of dodging completely, Sarah angled her body at the last moment, letting the hammer's energy graze past her while she lunged forward. She planted her foot, twisted, and delivered a precise kick to the side of his knee. A normal warrior would have collapsed. Kalarath did not. Instead, he simply pivoted with the blow, absorbing the impact, and slammed his fist into her ribs. The force sent her flying. She crashed against the arena wall, pain exploding through her body. The crowd gasped. For the first time since the fight began, Sarah didn't get up immediately. Kalarath cracked his neck, watching her. "You're strong," he admitted, "but you are not invincible." Sarah coughed, tasting copper in her mouth. Her ribs were cracked, maybe broken. She forced herself to stand. "Neither are you," she said, wiping the blood from her lip. Kalarath's eyes narrowed. "We'll see." The final strategy. Sarah's mind worked at lightning speed. Kalarath had no openings, no wasted movement. If she wanted to win this, she had to make one. Her body ached, but she pushed forward. Kalarath swung again, this time slower. He was testing her. She pretended to be weaker than she was, stumbling slightly. He took the bait. He lunged forward for a killing blow. At the last second, Sarah dropped low, ducking under his swing, and aiming her fist at the warhammer's hilt. With one precise hit, she dislodged the weapon from his grasp. Kalarath's eyes widened as his own warhammer flew from his hands, slamming into the arena floor. The crowd went wild. For the first time in the fight, Kalarath was unarmed. Sarah stood straight, rolling her sore shoulder. "Now let's see what you've got without your toys." Kalarath grinned. And then, he charged with his bare fists. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The warlord's wrath. The arena shook with the force of the battle. The crowd had never seen anything like this. A human standing against Kalarath the Executioner, the deadliest warrior in the Xarkath Empire, and surviving. Sarah Carter, bruised and battered, stood with her fists clenched, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Across from her, Kalarath cracked his knuckles, rolling his massive shoulders. His warhammer lay buried in the cracked arena floor, dislodged by Sarah's precise strike. The executioner was now unarmed. But that didn't make him weaker. If anything, he looked even more dangerous. Sarah wiped blood from her lip. "Guess we're doing this the old-fashioned way." Kalarath smirked. Let's see if you can handle it. And then he moved. A fight against death itself. Sarah barely had time to react. Kalarath was fast, too fast for something that size. A blur of motion, and then, boom. His fist slammed into her stomach, knocking the air from her lungs. The impact sent her skidding backward, her boots dragging against the cracked ground. Pain exploded through her ribs. The crowd roared, some in cheers, others in shock. Sarah forced herself to breathe, blinking through the haze of pain. She had been hit before, but not like that. Kalarath didn't give her a moment to recover. He was on her again, his massive fist swinging toward her skull. Sarah dropped low at the last second, barely dodging the blow. She felt the rush of air as his punch tore past her and shattered the stone wall behind her. Damn. If that had connected, she would have been dead instantly. This wasn't like fighting Vorak. Vorak had been strong, but predictable. Kalarath was something else entirely. He didn't just use raw strength. He fought with precision, strategy, and most terrifying of all, patience. He wasn't just attacking. He was studying her. Sarah realized something chilling. Kalarath wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't fighting to prove himself. He was fighting to end her, slowly, methodically, making sure she couldn't escape. The Xarkath Empire wanted her gone. Permanently. The warlord watches. High above the battlefield, the Grand Warlord observed the fight with an unreadable expression. The other warlords sat around him, their faces filled with unease. "This is dangerous," one of them muttered. "She should not have made it this far." The Grand Warlord remained silent. He had seen thousands of battles, and yet, he had never seen a human fight like this. If one human could do this, what would happen if there were more like her? The strategy shift. Sarah's mind worked fast. Kalarath had no wasted movements, no hesitation, no arrogance. That meant she had no openings, unless she created one. The decoy play. Kalarath came at her again, his massive fists swinging. Sarah dodged, intentionally slower than before. She let his next attack graze her side, making it look like she was slowing down. The audience gasped as blood trickled down her arm. The warlord smirked, believing she was finally weakening. Kalarath took the bait. His next attack came faster, harder, a strike meant to finish her. Sarah moved at the last second. Not backward, forward, inside his guard. Before he could react, she slammed both her fists into his exposed ribs, a brutal double impact to the same spot she had targeted earlier. Kalarath grunted, his massive form staggering for the first time. The crowd fell silent. Sarah wasn't done. She twisted her body, pivoting on one foot, and delivered a precise kick to the side of his knee. Kalarath buckled. His eyes widened in shock. Sarah had forced him down to one knee. For the first time in years, the executioner had been brought low. The crowd turns. The audience, once screaming for her death, was now on their feet. Some of them were cheering for her. This was no longer just a battle. This was a moment in history. A human had made a Xarkath war champion kneel. The warlords were no longer smiling. Kalarath's rage. Kalarath's chest heaved, his body tensed like a coiled predator. "You?" he growled, standing slowly. "You're something else." Sarah smirked, despite the pain. "You're not the first to say that." Kalarath took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders. Then he did something unexpected. He removed his armor. The heavy black plates fell to the ground with a metallic clang. The warlords gasped. The executioner never fought without his armor. "I underestimated you," Kalarath admitted. "I won't make that mistake again." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Well, Dan, the final round begins." The crowd had never been louder. The warlords were on edge. And in the center of the arena, two warriors stood, one human, one Xarkath, both battered, both bloodied, and neither willing to back down. Kalarath raised his fists. Sarah wiped blood from her mouth. Then, they charged. Humanity's victory. The arena was in chaos. The Xarketh had never witnessed a battle like this. Two warriors stood in the center of the battlefield. Sarah Carter, the human who defied their empire, and Calarath, the executioner, the deadliest fighter the Xarketh had ever produced. Both were bruised, bloodied, and battered. And neither was backing down. The warlord sat high above, silent for the first time. The crowd, which once screamed for Sarah's death, was now split. Some still demanded her execution. Others were cheering for her. The final clash begins. Sarah exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. Calarath stood bare-chested, his armor discarded, his massive frame covered in battle scars. He cracked his knuckles, his red eyes glowing with something new. Not anger, not arrogance. Respect. "You have my attention, human," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Few ever earn that." Sarah smirked. "Took you long enough." Calarath nodded once. And then, they charged. The deadliest dance. This was no longer a brawl. This was war. Calarath's fists blurred, each strike a death blow. Sarah weaved through them, her movements precise, dodging by inches. She countered with lightning-fast strikes, aiming for weak points, but Calarath was ready this time. He blocked her blows, twisting his body to absorb the force, striking back with devastating speed. A punch grazed her jaw, splitting her lip. A counter-strike slammed into his ribs, forcing him back. They fought like two predators, adapting with every second, reading each other's movements, looking for the one opening that would end it all. Sarah's breaking point. Sarah was fast. She was smart. But Calarath was inhumanly strong. Every block, every dodge, every move drained her energy. She could feel her body slowing down. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like stone. She knew she couldn't last much longer. Calarath saw it too. "You fought well," he said, stepping forward, "but you are finished." Sarah wiped blood from her face, smirking despite the pain. "You sure about that?" Calarath paused, and that's when he realized his mistake. Sarah's gambit. Sarah had spent the entire fight dodging, forcing Calarath to swing wildly, making him rely on raw power. She had let him believe she was on the defensive, but in reality, she had been setting him up. Calarath took one last step forward, and that's when Sarah moved. She exploded into motion, dodging his final strike by a hair's breadth. In that single, perfect moment, she struck. A brutal uppercut to his throat, a savage elbow to the side of his head, a precision knee strike to the ribs she had targeted earlier. Calarath staggered. For the first time, he lost his balance. Sarah wasn't done. She grabbed his massive wrist, twisted her body, and used his own momentum to throw him off his feet. The crowd screamed. Calarath hit the ground hard, dust exploding around him. Silence. A second passed. Then two. Sarah stood over him, her breath ragged, her body barely holding together. Calarath tried to rise, but his body refused to obey. The executioner had fallen. The arena erupted. The warlords' fury. High above, the warlords rose from their seats. Their expressions were dark, furious, afraid. The Grand Warlord clenched his clawed fist. "This cannot be allowed," one of the lesser warlords growled. "This fight is over," another sneered. "Kill her." Sarah heard every word. She turned to face them, spitting blood onto the ground. "Go ahead," she challenged. "Make your empire look even weaker." The warlords froze. The crowd was still screaming her name. Xarketh warriors in the stands were looking at her with awe. Killing her now, after she had earned their respect, would not make the empire stronger. It would make them cowards. The Grand Warlord's eyes narrowed. Slowly, he raised a hand. The execution order never came. Instead, the gong sounded. A single word boomed through the arena. Victor. Sarah Carter, the legend. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had won. Not just the fight, but the respect of an empire. Calarath sat up, rubbing his ribs, a deep chuckle rumbling in his chest. You really are something else, human. Sarah grinned. You put up a decent fight yourself, big guy. Calarath laughed, shaking his head. You know this is only the beginning, don't you? Sarah nodded. She had proven that humans weren't weak. Now, the entire galaxy would be watching. She turned her gaze up toward the warlords, meeting the Grand Warlord's cold stare. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. She had forced the Tsarkath to acknowledge her. Now she was going to make the entire galaxy remember her name. The beginning of a revolution.